There are moments in the vast, echoing sprawl of the Imperium where reality itself seems to hesitate, as though the galaxy breathes in and forgets how to exhale. I felt one such moment while standing beneath the shadow of an ancient vox-spire on a forgotten world at the fringe of Segmentum Solar, listening to the static-laced murmur of 1,000 distant prayers. They rose like heat from the manufactorum stacks, drifting upward into the poisoned sky, each one a whispered plea cast toward a presence entombed upon Terra. The thought of him, humanity's last and greatest bulwark, resting in a throne of golden agony, resonating through the Astronomican like a heartbeat carried across the void, had always been a distant, almost mythic truth. Yet that night, something in the air shifted. The static changed pitch. The ground trembled with a rhythm that did not belong to machines. And for a heartbeat, I felt as though the Emperor's slumbering mind, fractured and immeasurable, brushed against the edge of my own. There were no visions or holy proclamations, only a weight, an awareness, like a star waking from a long darkness and remembering its own fire. It left me shaken, breathless, and unable to decide whether I had stumbled upon a miracle or stepped into the prelude of something far more terrifying. For if the Emperor ever truly stirred, if the silent figure upon the golden throne ever drew a breath that was entirely his own again, then the galaxy would not simply change. It would rupture. If you've ever felt the pull of these mysteries, if the distant glow of the Astronomican stirs something in you the way it does in me, then stay with this journey. Share it. Pass it along the void routes of the algorithm as though sending a message past the warp. And if you wish to walk deeper into these shadows with me, lend your support with a like and a subscription, so the voice carrying this story can continue to echo in the dark places where most fear to look. Chapter 1. The First Shiver. I remember the night the air changed, because it felt as though the world itself had forgotten how to hold its balance. Not in any grand cinematic way. Not with the roar of orbital guns or the pounding march of the Astra Militarum, but with a subtle, almost intimate shift, like a whisper brushing the back of the mind. I had been working alone in the upper causeways of an abandoned manufactorum, cataloging what scraps of usable material still clung to its hollowed bones. The lamps flickered in their cages above me, shedding jaundiced light across rusted machinery, and the wind outside carried the distant, mournful chime of a broken warning bell swaying somewhere in the dark. It was not the kind of place where miracles were expected. Most who walked these forgotten sectors had long abandoned the idea that the Emperor's gaze fell on worlds like this. Yet that night, as I sifted through a pile of cracked data slates, a vibration passed through the floor, subtle enough that at first I mistook it for the groan of settling metal. Then it came again, firmer, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I paused, breath caught, waiting for the pattern to continue. It didn't. Instead, the lingering hum seemed to spread through the walls, bleeding into the stale air before dissolving entirely. I tried to shake it off as an afterimage of fatigue, but keeping that lie intact grew harder by the second. My auspex, which had been silent for hours, suddenly sputtered to life with a faint whine. Its runes blinked in erratic patterns, as though cycling through a memory it did not fully understand. I tapped it with 2 fingers, watching the readings flicker between empty space and phantom signatures that dissolved before they could resolve into form. A faulty unit, I told myself. A power surge. Anything but the idea that something far-reaching and immeasurable could be the cause. Outside the manufactorum walls, the night deepened. The sky was a sickly shade of ash gray, choked by dust storms that rose from the valley plains. Yet beneath that oppressive silence came a new sound, the low murmur of voices carried from the settlement far below. Usually, the workers' quarters stayed quiet after curfew, but tonight, scattered shouts and half-whispered chants drifted upward, blurred by distance and wind. They sounded confused, searching, as if trying to name something they had all sensed, but none could articulate. I packed my tools, descending the narrow stairwell that spiraled along the manufactorum's skeletal frame. Each step rang louder than it should have, echoing in a way that made the emptiness feel inhabited. By the time I reached the lower levels, the air had grown colder. Not the natural chill of metal corridors, but a deeper, more instinctive cold that sank into the bones like a premonition. The auspex flickered again. This time, instead of erratic patterns, A single rune burned bright, an alert signifying a surge of psi-active distortion. That alone should have set me running. Psychers were rare here, and anything that disturbed the warp was usually a death sentence for any unshielded soul in the vicinity. But curiosity rooted me in place. Some part of me, a part I'd never trusted, felt drawn toward whatever was unfolding beyond the manufactorum doors. So I stepped outside. The night greeted me with a wind laced in metallic dust. The settlement lights flickered unevenly in the distance, their glow painting broken silhouettes across the uneven terrain. People were gathering in small knots throughout the streets, pointing upward toward the sky. I followed their gaze. At first, I saw nothing but the usual blank expanse. Then, slowly, a faint pulse of light shimmered across the firmament, almost too soft to perceive. It reminded me of the heartbeat of a colossal creature, sleeping somewhere deep beneath the crust of the world. A woman standing nearby clutched her shawl tighter. "The Astronomican," she murmured, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. It felt wrong for a moment, like its rhythm stumbled. Her companion shook his head. "You're hearing things. There's no way we'd feel something from Terra out here. Not unless—" He stopped, unwilling to finish the thought. I understood why. To even suggest that the Golden Throne had faltered, or shifted, or changed in any way, was enough to invite fear deeper than anything the warp could conjure. It was like saying the sun had blinked, or that mountains had begun to breathe. But standing there, watching the faint quiver of light, and feeling the echo of that impossible vibration fade through my skull, I couldn't ignore the truth forming at the edge of my awareness. Something had touched the Imperium, not here, not in this dusty outpost, but everywhere. Something vast, something old, something that had not moved in 10,000 years. A pulse rippled through the crowd, not physical, but emotional, a collective breath held tight in the lungs. Then, without warning, a young astropath near the center of the square collapsed to her knees. I recognized her by the black band she wore across her eyes, the sign of one who had stared too deeply into the warp for too long. Her mouth moved soundlessly. Her fingers clawed at the cracked stone beneath her, and though no one dared approach her, all leaned in, waiting. Finally, her voice tore free in a thin, trembling whisper. "He is dreaming." The words fell like stones dropped into a pool. The ripples radiated outward in stunned silence. A few shook their heads, rejecting her claim outright. Others stepped back in fear. Some bowed, whispering prayers with shaking lips. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk her words up to exhaustion or madness, but the certainty in her voice pierced through me. The auspex at my belt crackled one last time, then died completely, unable to process the residue of whatever she had sensed. The woman beside me whispered, "If that's true, what happens when he wakes?" The question hung in the cold air, unanswered, vibrating like a string pulled taut between terror and hope. And though none of us spoke it aloud, we all felt the same thing. The first shiver had passed, but something far greater was coming. The settlement did not sleep after the astropathic collapse. Fear has a way of rearranging the night, stretching every shadow into a question and every silence into a warning. People drifted through the streets in uneven currents, murmuring as though afraid to speak too loudly, as if the very act of giving voice to their thoughts might summon consequences they could not name. I found myself moving with them, not toward any destination but away from the square, away from the tremor that still pulsed faintly behind my eyes. The air tasted of ozone, sharp and dry, as though lightning had struck somewhere beyond the horizon. The more I walked, the more I felt that same indescribable weight pressing gently at the back of my skull. It wasn't painful, not exactly, but persistent, like a stare from someone you could not see. I tried focusing on the rhythm of my own footsteps, the crunch of gravel, the hiss of sand carried on the wind, but those sounds only emphasized how unnaturally quiet everything else had become. A distant Vox tower blinked with irregular light. Its signal, usually a steady beat, now flickered with uneven pulses that reminded me of the distorted glow we had seen in the sky. I passed beneath it, listening to the faint static seeping from its speakers. The noise carried a strange cadence, almost anticipatory, as though something was trying to form words within the hiss, but lacked the strength or coherence to do so. For a moment, I considered going inside one of the dormitory blocks to find refuge, but the idea felt hollow. For walls would not keep out whatever had brushed against the warp, whatever had brushed against us. So instead I wandered toward the administratum outpost built against the ridge, hoping that the factorum scribes or the overseer might have an explanation, anything that could anchor the night back into something recognizable. The outpost was lit by a handful of glow lanterns strung along its metal awning. The doors were open, spilling light onto the packed earth. Inside, scribes huddled around a central cogitator pillar, arguing in sharp, clipped tones. Their parchment-thin voices carried across the room, brittle with tension. The relay readings reset at precisely the same moment. One insisted. Every system in the Western grid surged, then stabilized. That doesn't mean anything, another snapped. Asynchronized malfunction is still a malfunction. You're making connections that aren't there. And what of the astropath? The first countered. Her mind is directly attuned to the warp. She felt something. They all did. A silence fell, heavy and telling. Everyone knew that astropaths, for all their frailty, rarely spoke lightly of such matters. When they did, their words carried the weight of the Imperium behind them. I stepped closer, unsure whether to interrupt. It didn't matter. The overseer turned her stern features toward me the moment she noticed my presence. Deep lines carve her face, and the dim lighting-etched shadows beneath her eyes. "You felt it too," she said, not as a question but as a statement. I nodded slowly. I felt something. A vibration. A pressure. The scribes exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, "He isn't supposed to move." "Not ever." "Not move." Another corrected softly. "Not die." "Those are not the same." A chill crawled along my spine. They were speaking of the Emperor with the grammar of uncertainty, and that alone felt blasphemous even in the privacy of a dim outpost. Yet none of us could pretend that the night had been ordinary. The overseer motioned for me to follow her to the far end of the chamber, where a narrow observation slit faced the horizon. She stood with her hands clasped behind her, shoulders squared, gaze steady. "Look there," she murmured. A faint glow pulsed at the horizon's edge, not bright, not dramatic, but steady in an unnatural way. It was too rhythmic to be a malfunctioning Prometheum flare, too deliberate to be reflected light. "That started a few minutes after the astropath fell," she said quietly. "It aligns with the Astronomican's direction, but we shouldn't be able to perceive it from here with the naked eye." "Then what is it?" She exhaled slowly, as though weighing every possible answer and finding none safe to speak. "Something is echoing through the warp, a disturbance or a shift, and for the first time in my life, I cannot tell if it is a blessing or a warning." Her honesty unsettled me more than anything else had that night. Before I could respond, the building trembled with a low rumble. Papers fluttered from their stacks. The glow lanterns swayed on their hooks. Outside, distant screams rose as people staggered in fear. But the tremor passed as quickly as it came, leaving only dust drifting in the lantern light. A scribe whispered. It felt like a heartbeat. Another replied, "No, more like breath." The overseer turned toward me, her face grave and pale. "Something ancient has stirred," she said. "Something we were never meant to feel." Beyond the horizon, the faint glow brightened and dimmed with slow precision, and the night, for all its silence, felt unbearably alive. The night felt stretched thin, as though reality itself were holding its breath alongside us. Every instinct urged me to leave the outpost and return to the manufactorum, to bury myself in routine and pretend that the world had not shifted beneath my feet. But leaving the overseer and the scribes in their brittle silence felt wrong, like walking away from a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. So instead, I stepped out into the chill air once more and let the settlement pull me back toward its uneasy heartbeat. Voices drifted through the narrow streets, hushed, strained, carrying the weight of people who had seen too many strange nights to trust that this one would end gently. The glow on the horizon still pulsed with slow, unnatural rhythm, and every time it brightened, the air seemed to thicken with a feeling that was neither fear nor expectation, but some impossible blend of both. I passed figures, standing motionless on thresholds, watching the sky with the posture of those awaiting judgment. Children clung to their mothers' robes. Workers who usually staggered home half-drunk after curfew now walked sober and alert, their eyes wary. An old man sat on a crate near the central thoroughfare, clutching a battered Imperial Aquila to his chest. His lips moved constantly, murmuring prayers under his breath. As I approached, he lifted his gaze, cloudy with age yet sharp with something like recognition. "You felt it," he said, his voice dry as sand. All of us did. Even the machines shuddered. I crouched slightly to hear him better. "Do you know what it means?" "No one knows," he whispered. "Not truly. But there's stories, old stories, from the earliest days after the siege. Tales whispered by those who tended to the golden throne. They said that sometimes, only sometimes, the Emperor's presence would ripple outward. A warning, they claimed. Or a reminder. A reminder of what? That he still exists somewhere deeper than death." His words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. Before I could respond, a sudden commotion rose from farther down the street. A cluster of people had gathered near a cracked fountain, forming a loose circle around a man who writhed on the ground. At first, I thought him injured, but as I drew closer, I saw the signs immediately. Foam at the lips, hands clawing at his temples, eyes rolled back white. A psyker, and one who had just been struck by something beyond his control. The crowd kept their distance, hovering in terrified curiosity. No one dared touch him. A woman began reciting a protective litany under her breath, her trembling voice barely louder than the sound of the wind. I moved to the edge of the circle, unsure if I should intervene. His limbs thrashed with unnatural strength, as though he were wrestling some invisible force, pinning him to the cracked stone. Then, abruptly, he stilled. His chest rose once, shuddering. A faint glow traced itself along the veins of his neck, like embers cooling after a forge flare. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head toward us. His eyes were no longer blank. They burned with clarity, sharp and terrified. "He is restless," the psyker gasped. "The throne burns. The Astronomican flickers." I heard. His voice faltered, choked by something he could not articulate. He reached outward with shaking fingers, as though trying to pull words from the air itself. "I heard thought," he whispered. A collective shiver passed through the crowd. One of the onlookers murmured, "That's impossible. The Emperor doesn't think. Not like." The psyker screamed, a sound so raw it forced everyone to recoil. He convulsed again, but this time it was different, more like a recoil of his mind and his body. When he collapsed back onto the ground, his breath came in ragged bursts. "He dreamed," he whispered. "Only for a breath. Only for a heartbeat." But we felt it, all of us attuned enough to hear the warp tremble. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I could not name. Not madness. Not delusion. Something truer, sharper, carved deep into the marrow of him by whatever force had struck his mind. "Whatever woke him," the psyker rasped, "is not finished." Before anyone could react, he slumped forward, unconscious. The crowd scattered in a panic, leaving me standing alone beside the fallen man, surrounded by the echo of his final words. The glow on the horizon pulsed again, brighter than before, and the air felt charged as though lightning waited just above the surface of the sky. Without thinking, I stepped back, almost stumbling. My heart hammered with a rhythm that felt foreign, unfamiliar, as though trying to match itself to the slow pulse in the heavens. A weight settled over the settlement, the weight of realization, of a shared moment none of us were prepared to name. The Emperor had not awoken. Not truly. But something had brushed against his eternal vigil. Something vast enough to be felt across worlds. Something no mortal mind could shrug off. I turned away from the square, from the psyker, from the people whose quiet panic had begun to unravel into open fear. And as I walked, I knew with cold certainty that the first shiver had deepened into something far more dangerous. Something irreversible. Somewhere far away, light years beyond the dust-choked sky, the golden throne burned just a little brighter. I didn't intend to wander back toward the manufactorum, yet my feet carried me there as though the building itself had become an anchor in a night too unsteady to trust. The sky still pulsed with that faint, impossible rhythm, But now each flicker felt sharper, more deliberate. It was as if the glow on the horizon had synchronized with something beating deep beneath the surface of reality, a pulse not meant for mortal senses. The manufactorum loomed ahead like a rusted skeleton half buried in the sand. Its broken chimneys jutted into the sky, the shadows long and uneven beneath the trembling light. I slipped inside through a jagged breach, the metal edges cold beneath my fingers. The air inside was dense with the scent of old lubricant and oxidized iron. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of distant support beams, the soft patter of dust falling from forgotten rafters, the faint hum of dormant machinery that hadn't tasted power in years. I made my way toward the central assembly hall, where conveyor belts once roared and servitors shuffled tirelessly under the load of industry. The space was vast and empty now, the silence broken only by the groaning protest of ancient joints cooling in the night air. But as I stepped onto the cracked stone floor, the feeling I had sensed earlier returned. Not the faint ripple that had swept across the Imperium, but its residue, lingering like static after lightning. The auspex at my belt, dead since the astropathic collapse, flickered with a weak glow. A single rune blinked once, then again, then stabilized in a dim, trembling pulse. It was responding to something inside the manufactorum. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down my spine as I scanned the hall. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then a sound echoed from the far end of the chamber, a metallic clank, sharp and deliberate. Not the settling of old machinery, not an accidental shift. A footstep. I froze. The manufactorum had no active workers, no patrols, no servitors assigned to its broken production lines. Whoever, or whatever, was moving inside had no right to exist here. I edged along the wall, the auspex growing brighter with each step. The blinking rune strained, pulsing faster, struggling to interpret whatever presence lurked in the dark. Another footstep rang out, closer this time, too heavy to belong to a human moving casually, too irregular to be the march of a trained soldier. A faint silhouette emerged through the haze of dust suspended in the air. Not a man, a servitor, or what had once been one. Its body was half collapsed, its metal components exposed and rusted. One of its limbs twitched in erratic spasms, the joints grinding as though resisting an unseen force. But what chilled me wasn't its broken appearance. It was the fact that the servitor had been offline for years, an inert relic of a dead industry. Yet now, its single remaining optic flickered with intermittent light, casting a faint, sickly glow across the floor. It turned its head, not with the smooth, predetermined motion of its programming, but with a slow, searching tilt, as though trying to focus on something it had never been designed to perceive. A mechanical groan rattled from its vox grill. 3 words scraped out, warped and distorted, carried on failing speakers that had no power to operate. He is awake. The sound tore through the empty hall, like a blade of ice. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, the auspex pulsing wildly as though near overload. The servitor's body convulsed, jerking with unnatural strength. Its system, whatever remained of it, was attempting to imitate a message it could not understand, forced to vocalize something imprinted upon its corrupted neural pathways by a disturbance that should have been felt only by minds attuned to the warp. Machines did not feel the warp. Machines did not dream. Machines did not speak of the Emperor. Yet the broken servitor lifted its head again, hydraulic fluid dripping like dark tears from its ruined jaw. Awake, awake, awake. Each repetition grew fainter, as if the word itself was burning the last threads holding its body together. With a violent shudder, the servitor collapsed, its limbs folding beneath it like crumpled iron. The optic dimmed to nothing. The manufactorum fell silent once more, but the auspex still pulsed. Not toward the corpse, toward the sky. I stepped outside, heartbeat pounding, and found the settlement transformed. People stood frozen in the streets, staring upward. The horizon's glow had grown, no longer a faint pulse, but a steady, throbbing shimmer spreading across the firmament, like the reflection of a distant star trying to break through a veil. My breath fogged in the suddenly cold air. A wave of pressure rolled across the world, soft but immense, the kind that pushed against every bone and thought simultaneously. In that moment, Every astropath across the settlement screamed. Their voices rose in perfect unison, echoing through the night as if pulled from their throats by a hand far larger than any mortal mind. Some clutched their heads. Some collapsed. Some simply whispered the same two words through bloodied lips. He dreams. The glow flared, brilliant, blinding, and for a single impossible second, the sky felt alive with thought. Not words, not images, but presence. Something stirred across the warp. Something ancient, colossal, and bound to a throne that had never cooled in 10,000 years. Then the light dimmed. The pressure vanished. Silence fell. But the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like anticipation, the kind that comes just before the galaxy changes forever. The silence after the flare was heavier than any sound. It pressed down on the settlement with suffocating weight, as though the entire world were wrapped in the lingering echo of something vast, withdrawing just beyond mortal reach. I stood in the open, staring at the now dark horizon, feeling the faint tremor still pulsing beneath my skin like an aftershock that refused to fade. Around me, the people of the settlement remained frozen, dazed, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from revelation. Slowly, movement returned to the streets. A child whimpered. Someone dropped to their knees in prayer, bowing their head toward Terra, though they had no direct sight of it. A man muttered about omens. A woman sobbed quietly, clutching her rosary so tightly the bones of her fingers whitened. The astropaths, those who were still conscious, huddled together in a trembling cluster, their robes fluttering in the cold wind. One of them looked up, her bandaged eyes turned blindly toward the sky, and whispered something too soft to hear. Whatever it was, it carried such raw grief that it pulled at something inside me. I turned away before I could be drawn deeper into the grief, the awe, the terror rippling through the crowd. My mind felt stretched thin, frayed at the edges, as though the momentary brush with that impossible presence had scraped something loose inside me. The manufactorum loomed at my back, a hollow carcass that no longer felt like a place of industry, but a witness, an empty skeleton that had watched something sacred crack open. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the familiar grit of dust beneath my boots, the distant hum of the Vox spire recalibrating itself, the faint metallic tang that the air always carried after a storm. Yet nothing anchored me. The world had shifted, and everything familiar felt slightly misaligned, as though reality itself were still adjusting to the shock. A figure approached from the direction of the administratum outpost, the overseer. Her pace was steady, but her eyes betrayed the same shaken awe I felt inside myself. She stopped beside me, her gaze fixed on the sky, even though the light had vanished. "You saw it," she said quietly. "I felt it," I replied. She nodded. "We all did, even those who claim they didn't align to themselves. Something touched this world tonight." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. She clenched them behind her back, trying to hide the movement. "What does it mean?" I asked. She exhaled slowly, her breath ghosting in the cold air. "If the Emperor stirs, even in the faintest way, the Imperium will feel it. Not just psychers, not just astropaths. Everything aligned to his will, from the Astronomican to the warp lanes, will tremble. But we were never meant to sense that, never meant to stand close enough to feel the echo of his dreaming." The word hung between us, fragile, uncertain. Dreaming. It felt impossible to describe the sensation any other way. Before I could respond, a tremor rolled beneath our feet. Not strong, not dangerous, but unmistakable. The earth seemed to shift in a long, slow breath. The overseer tensed. A few people gasped. A stray glow lantern swayed on its hook, casting a wavering path of light across the dirt. "It's passing," she murmured. "Whatever happened, it's ending." But even as she said it, I knew she didn't believe it. The tremor was not a beginning or an ending. It was an afterthought, a fragment, a final echo of something too immense to comprehend. The horizon faded back into its usual dead gray. The wind returned to its shallow sigh. The world resumed its slow rotation through the darkness. But nothing was the same. I felt it deep in my chest, an ache that had not been there before, a sense of proximity to something sacred and terrifying, something I was never meant to touch. The settlement slowly dispersed, its people drifting back to their quarters, with the hollow steps of those carrying a truth too heavy for words. The overseer turned to me. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will bring questions none of us are prepared to answer." Rest. The word felt meaningless. I nodded anyway. She walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd. I remained where I stood, staring at the empty sky where the impossible glow had once pulsed, and felt the echo of it lingering behind my ribs. For the first time in my life, I understood how fragile the galaxy truly was, how dependent everything was on the quiet, eternal vigil of a single being whose burden dwarfed every star in the heavens. If what we felt was only a dream, what would happen if he truly woke? The thought followed me as I finally forced myself to move, carrying it with me into the cold hours before dawn. And above the world, somewhere far beyond the warp's shifting tides, the Astronomican flickered once, soft, uncertain, like the fading memory of a dream. Then the night swallowed the light, and the first shiver passed into history. But the fear of what came next did not. Shall I begin Chapter 2? The echo through flesh and steel. The dawn that followed was thin and colorless, the kind of light that barely seemed strong enough to peel back the shadows clinging to the settlement. No one spoke of sleep. Most had not even tried. The workers emerged from their dwellings with stiff movements and hollow eyes, moving in patterns that felt instinctive rather than conscious, like insects shaken from their hive. The faint hum of industry that usually greeted morning was absent. Even the few active generators near the hab blocks sputtered with inconsistent rhythm, as though still recovering from a disturbance that had reached deeper than circuits and wires. I stepped outside into the brittle morning air, feeling the fatigue settle into my bones with slow, grinding weight. The manufactorum still loomed behind me, but I could no longer look at it without seeing the broken servitor twitching in the dark. A machine roused into unnatural awareness by something that should never have brushed its dormant mind. Its twisted voice still echoed at the edge of my memory, as though caught in the lowest register of thought. "Awake, awake." The settlement's central Vox tower emitted a static-laced broadcast, attempting to re-establish its morning schedule. Every few seconds the transmission cut out, swallowed by sudden bursts of crackling interference. People paused beneath its shadow to listen, their expressions shifting between hope and dread as though expecting the machine to speak prophecy rather than updates. When the overseer's voice finally emerged through the distortion, it carried a strain I had never heard from her before. "All workers remain in your sectors. Operations are suspended until further notice. Stay within approved boundaries. Report any anomalous behavior in equipment or personnel." The message repeated twice, then dissolved into static. Anomalous behavior. The words hit harder than they should have. Machines across the settlement had always been stubborn, prone to failures born of age and neglect, but none had ever whispered warnings from a cold Vox grill. None had echoed the thoughts of psychers. None had spoken of the Emperor. I made my way toward the lower districts, where mechanized loaders and transport skiffs were usually active at dawn. This time, the path was empty, but as I passed the vehicle bays, I noticed something strange. A cargo hauler, one of the older models designed for heavy Prometheum drums, sat in the center of the garage, with its engine housing partially open. Its lights flickered weakly, cycling between red and amber as though caught in a loop it couldn't escape. Curious, I approached. The hauler's engine should have been cold. It hadn't been used in weeks, yet faint heat radiated from the metal, increasing as I drew closer. A soft vibration hummed beneath its chassis, barely perceptible but unmistakable. I knelt, placing my hand against the frame. The machine's internal mechanisms trembled like something alive. As if responding to my touch, the hauler's Vox unit crackled to life. At first, only static. Then a sound, a low groan, like metal scraping against metal. And beneath it, something that might have been a word. Not a full one, not shaped by intention, but the ghost of a voice trying to form itself through a machine that had no lungs, no mouth, no mind. I stepped back. The vibration increased, rattling bolts and sending dust drifting from overhead beams. The engine coughed, sputtered, then surged with sudden force as if attempting to start on its own. Lights flared. The hauler's front grille twitched, jerking upward as though the machine were trying to rear forward. The sound that followed wasn't speech, not like the servitor's tortured whisper, but the raw echo of something, some impression, imprinted upon its systems by the same disturbance that had rippled across the warp the night before. A technician emerged from a nearby doorway and froze at the sight, his face drained of color. "It's been offline for months," he whispered. "Nothing's connected. Nothing's powering it." As if to contradict him, the hauler lurched. Just once. A violent, unnatural jerk of its heavy frame that left streaks of scorched metal across the floor. The technician swore and stumbled back. Then, just as suddenly as it had awoken, the machine went still. The lights dimmed. The hum faded. The heat bled away as though sucked into the cold air. The hauler sagged in place like a creature falling back into sleep. We both stood motionless for a long moment, the echo of that impossible shudder lingering in the air. The technician's breaths came fast and uneven. "Did you hear it?" he finally asked. I nodded, though answering felt like admitting something forbidden. "It wasn't just the servitors," he said. His voice shook. "The smaller loaders started twitching last night. A cogitator in the comm spire started translating data into patterns none of us recognized. Even the purifier drones, Emperor help us, started humming hymns." Hymns. Machines humming hymns. His words settled heavily between us. Whatever had rippled across the warp had not stopped with Psychers. It was moving through flesh and steel alike, brushing against anything remotely sensitive to signal, pattern, or resonance. The technician ran a trembling hand through his hair. "If this is happening here, what's happening on worlds closer to Terra?" The question felt too large for the morning air. Too large for any of us. A sudden, piercing scream cut through the garage, echoing from the street outside. We spun toward the sound as more shouts followed, fearful, urgent, swelling from multiple voices. Something else had begun. Something worse. Something that told us the echo was far from over. The screams multiplied before we even reached the street. They weren't the sharp, panicked cries of people reacting to danger they could see. These were deeper, raw, instinctive, torn from throats by something that clawed at the mind rather than the flesh. The technician sprinted beside me, his breath ragged, boots pounding the dirt as we rounded the corner into the central thoroughfare. A crowd had gathered around the Vox Tower. Dozens of people stood in a wide, trembling ring, staring upward with faces drained of all color. I pushed through them, ignoring the frantic whispers and choked sobs, until I could see what had formed the center of their terror. 3 Skitarii patrol units stood below the tower, though stood was a generous term. Their bodies twitched in violent, stuttering motions, limbs jerking as though someone were pulling invisible strings attached to their joints. Each warrior's red hood had fallen back, exposing gleaming augmetic skull plates beneath, and their optics flickered in erratic pulses that revealed no pattern born of logic. They were malfunctioning, but not in any way I had seen before. Skitarii were crafted to withstand extremes, electrical surges, magnetic storms, even psychic static. Their minds were fortified by layers of Benharic code and machine doctrine. Yet now those minds buckled beneath unseen pressure, their bodies spasming like puppets caught in the grip of a child who didn't know its own strength. The nearest one emitted a burst of static through its vox grill. The sound warped into a rising shriek that didn't belong to any human throat, but neither was it purely mechanical. It carried undertones, tones that vibrated at the base of the skull and made something inside me recoil. The second Skitarius jerked its head toward us. Its optics flared bright white, casting sharp beams across the crowd. The light carved every terrified face with stark detail. A woman beside me fell to her knees, covering her ears as tears streamed down her cheeks. Then, suddenly, the Skitarii froze. All 3. Instant stillness. Their limbs hung mid-spasm, suspended between motion and paralysis, as though time around them had locked. Even the dust drifting in the air seemed to pause. A collective breath rippled through the crowd. A single tone hummed through the Vox Tower. Not an alarm, not a broadcast. A note. Low, pure, resonant. It vibrated through the metal spire, through the ground, through bone. I felt it sink into me like a weight dropped into water. The Skitarii responded instantly. Their bodies straightened with unnatural precision, heads snapping toward the horizon in perfect unison, optics dimming to faint pinpricks. Another tone followed, slightly higher, then another, and another. A sequence, not random, a pattern. The Skitarii lifted their weapons, slowly, deliberately, not in hostility, not in defense, with ritualistic gravity, as though responding to a command they had no power to refuse. Someone gasped. Another whispered a prayer. The crowd instinctively drew back as the third Skitarii stepped forward, planting its feet in the dust, like a soldier standing to attention before a superior that none of us could see. Then they spoke. All three. At once. Their voices merged into a single distorted utterance that vibrated with layers of broken benharic, fractured vox distortion, and something rawer beneath. A cadence that sounded disturbingly close to the echo we had felt the night before. The word stretched, twisted, almost unrecognizable, but not enough to hide its meaning. Astronomy. The vox cracked. One of the Skitarii's vocalizers sparked violently. Another's chest plate split open from internal pressure, venting steam in a blast of white. They struggled, as though trying to force a word their systems weren't built to contain. Astronomica. The last syllable broke apart, dissolving into a feedback scream so powerful the Vox Tower lights burst in cascading sparks. People staggered back, clutching their heads. The noise pierced into thought itself, a shrill tearing inside the mind that made vision blur and breath stutter. And then, silence. The Skitarii collapsed as one, their bodies hitting the ground like metal statues pushed from pedestals. Dust rose. Sparks flickered. No movement followed. For several moments, no one dared approach, not even the bravest among us. The technician beside me swallowed hard, his voice barely a breath. They were trying to say Astronomican. I knew he was right. I had felt the shape of the word even before it fully formed, and the implications hung heavy in the air, pressing down like a suffocating shroud. The Astronomican was the Emperor's light, his constant, his unfaltering beacon. No mortal, no machine, no hybrid of flesh and steel should have been able to sense anything about its state unless trained and attuned. And yet 3 Skitarii, souls carved and reforged into vessels of logic, not faith, had been pulled into its struggle. Whatever had brushed the warp last night was now digging deeper, reaching across barriers built over millennia. This was no residual echo. This was escalation. The Overseer arrived moments later, flanked by 2 enforcers. She took in the scene, her jaw tightening as she knelt beside the fallen Skitarii. She pressed a hand to one of their neck ports, checking for any sign of function. Nothing. Not even a spark of benharic code. They're not dead, she said softly. Just overridden. By what? She did not say. She didn't need to. We all felt the answer looming above us like a shadow that had not yet chosen where to fall. She rose to her feet and met my gaze. This isn't localized, she said. Whatever's happening, it's spreading. Her eyes gleamed with something colder than fear. It's reaching everything. Before I could respond, a new sound cut through the morning, a rising, distant wail from the astropath's quarters. Not a scream. A keening chorus. Voices braided in dread. The second echo had begun. The wail that rose from the astropath quarters was unlike the screams from the night before. Those had been sharp, momentary, like nerves snapping under violent strain. This was sustained. A long, mournful cry that rose and fell in waves, reverberating through the settlement with a cadence that felt too deliberate to be chaos and too chaotic to be prayer. It was the sound of minds caught in a tide they could neither resist nor escape. People scattered from the main street, rushing toward shelter or falling to their knees, with hands clasped in trembling devotion. The Overseer didn't hesitate. She ran toward the source of the sound, and I followed, the technician close behind. The closer we drew, the more powerful the pressure in the air became, as if the very atmosphere thickened with each step. It felt like pushing through invisible water, cold, heavy, suffocating. The astropathic enclave sat on the far edge of the settlement, a low, reinforced structure built from dense stone and layered shielding. As we approached, The keening intensified, rising into harmonics that vibrated in the skull like a swarm of invisible insects. The building's outer wards flickered erratically, arcs of pale energy snapping across the sigils carved into the stone. It reminded me of the Haller's lights, the same flickering, the same struggle to remain stable under unseen interference. A group of enforcers stood outside, their shock mauls held with white-knuckled uncertainty. One of them spotted the overseer and rushed forward, his face pale beneath the harsh morning glare. "They've all gone down," he said, voice trembling. "Not unconscious, but deeper. They're locked inside something. And the wards, Emperor save us. The wards are rejecting them." The overseer pushed past him, her jaw set. "Open the doors." "Ma'am, with respect," the enforcer began. She cut him off. "Now." Reluctantly, he keyed the access rune. The heavy door slid open with a grinding protest, releasing a wave of frigid air that washed over us like breath exhaled from a crypt. The interior was dim, lit only by the flicker of failing lumen strips. We stepped inside. All 12 resident astropaths lay on the floor of the central hall, arranged in a loose, chaotic circle as though they had collapsed mid-step. Their eyes moved beneath their lids in rapid, frantic patterns. Their fingers twitched. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, as though speaking in another space entirely. One of them, a young woman whose name I vaguely remembered as Lyra, lay nearest to us. Her body convulsed once, then stilled, her face contorting into an expression of awe and terror intertwined so tightly it was impossible to separate them. I knelt beside her. "Lyra," I whispered, "can you hear me?" Her lips parted. For a moment, no sound emerged. Then quiet, trembling, she exhaled a single word. "Bright." Her voice cracked. She inhaled, as though drawing breath through broken glass. "Too bright." The overseer's eyes widened. "She's connected. The disturbance is pulling them deeper into the warp." As if responding to her words, a violent pulse of psychic pressure rolled through the room. The lumen strips exploded in a burst of sparks, plunging us into near darkness. I stumbled, shielding my eyes. Another scream tore itself from one of the astropaths, a raw, primal sound of a mind stretched far beyond human limits. The technician grabbed my arm, steadying me. "We shouldn't be in here," he whispered. "This isn't for unshielded minds. Whatever they're seeing, whatever they're feeling, it's bleeding into the air." He was right. I could feel the edges of something brushing against my thoughts. Not images, not words. A sensation. Vast, cold, endless. The overseer knelt beside another astropath, an elder whose face was etched with deep creases. She pressed her ear close to his mouth, listening. Her expression darkened. "What did he say?" I asked. She stood slowly, her voice quiet. "He said the Astronomican is shifting." She swallowed hard. "He said it is pulling away from them." The idea struck like a blow. The Astronomican had always been a constant, an anchor. To feel it withdraw, even slightly, would be like watching the sun flicker mid-sky. Another pulse rolled through the hall. This one was stronger, sharp, forceful, carrying a faint metallic taste that coated the back of the throat. The astropaths arched their backs. Their voices rose as one, forming a single, trembling chorus. "He sees." A pause. A shudder. A crackle of psychic static that made every lumen flicker. "He sees." Then a final whisper, stretched thin as a dying breath. "He sees us." The silence that followed was suffocating. The overseer staggered back, her face ashen. The enforcers exchanged horrified glances. The technician let out a shaky exhale that sounded more like a sob. My own heartbeat hammered, so violently I could barely hear anything else. The implication wrapped itself around my spine like a cold hand. If the Emperor's presence, fractured, constrained, and immeasurable, had turned even the smallest fragment of attention toward the warp near this world, what else was he seeing? And why? Before any of us could speak, the ground shook, harder this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. The wards along the walls flared red, overloaded by surges of psychic interference. Outside, another scream tore across the settlement. Then another, and another, voices rising in a chain reaction of terror. The overseer drew a sharp breath. "It's not just the astropaths," she whispered. "It's everyone." Something enormous was sweeping across the world, a ripple, a wave, an unseen force spreading like wildfire. The echo wasn't passing. It was deepening. The tremors didn't stop at the enclave. They rippled outward, shaking dust from rooftops and sending loose stones skittering across the ground. But it wasn't the earth that frightened me. It was the sense, deep, instinctive, undeniable, that something unseen was passing over the settlement like a shadow cast by a star we could not perceive. A pressure that squeezed thought and breath into something small and brittle. We rushed outside, stumbling into the pale daylight, just as a wave of voices rose from the nearby hablocks. The sound was chaotic, layered with fear and confusion. Men and women staggered from their dwellings with glazed eyes, clutching their heads as though trying to hold their minds in place. A child cried out, pointing at the sky. A trader dropped to the ground, hands shaking violently. Even the animals, feral pack creatures, that lingered near the outskirts, scattered in frenzied panic. The overseer steadied herself against the wall, breath trembling. The entire settlement, it's happening to all of them. But it wasn't the same convulsion that had struck the astropaths. This was something different, something broader and more invasive. Not a focused psychic surge, but a sweeping resonance saturating the air, the soil, the very fabric of the world. The technician grabbed my shoulder, turning me toward one of the outer streets. "Look." At first I didn't understand what I was seeing. People stood motionless, dozens of them, frozen mid-step as though caught in a stasis field. Their faces slack, their eyes unfocused, their bodies swaying slightly in the faint wind. Then, as if pulled by a single thread, they all lifted their heads at once. Every one of them. Their eyes, young, old, weary, terrified, fixed on the sky. The horizon shimmered, not with light, with distortion, like heat rising off metal, except slower, thicker. A ripple across the fabric of morning. The air wavered in silence, bending as though something massive pressed against it from the outside. A murmur passed through the crowd, soft, trembling, unbidden. I felt it as much as heard it. A whisper that crawled across the mind like a breeze drifting through a doorway left slightly ajar. "He sees us." Not a voice. Not a message. Just a sensation. Too large for language. Too faint for comprehension. Too vast for humanity. A man in the crowd fell to his knees, tears streaking down his dust-coated face. "It's him," he murmured. "It's his gaze." He pressed his forehead to the ground, as though seeking shelter in the dirt. The Emperor. But his voice broke. Hope cracked beneath the weight of something he could not name. Because it wasn't benevolence that washed over us, nor wrath, nor judgment. It was attention. Raw, immense, indifferent, like the feeling of standing near a tidal wave that had not yet decided whether to break. The distortion thickened. The air grew heavy. A distant ringing filled my ears, high, thin, barely perceptible, like the last breath of a dying star. I staggered, vision blurring, heart hammering in my chest, as though trying to outrun a shadow that hadn't yet fallen. The overseer grabbed my arm to steady me. Her voice trembled. "This isn't just a ripple." She swallowed hard. "This is alignment. He's aligning with something in the warp." I felt it too. The pressure that had brushed our minds the night before was different now, sharper, more direct. No longer a distant pulse, but something leaning closer. Too close. A sudden crackle snapped across the settlement's vox speakers. Static roared, drowning the world in white noise. Lights flickered. Power conduits sparked in erratic bursts. Then, beneath the static, a tone emerged. Deep, endless, resonant. A sound that felt older than human civilization, older than the Imperium, older than the Golden Throne itself. People clutched their ears. Some screamed. Others stood transfixed, their bodies trembling as though the sound vibrated through their marrow. The tone deepened, spiraling downward into frequencies that made vision stutter and breath falter. The warp was straining. Reality was bowing. Something colossal was pushing against the barrier between thought and matter. The tone stopped. Silence. A single heartbeat of stillness. Then the world exhaled. The distortion across the sky vanished. The shimmering air settled. People collapsed where they stood, some sobbing, some gasping, some simply staring in numb disbelief. The technician sank to the ground, burying his face in his hands. The overseer steadied herself against a rusted railing, breathing hard. What was that? I whispered. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely audible. A shift in the Astronomican's frequency, but not a normal fluctuation. She shook her head slowly. It's being pulled, redirected, reshaped by something that isn't a throne. Then what? I asked. She looked at me, not with fear, but with realization. He's not waking. A pause. He's focusing. The words struck deeper than any scream, because the idea of the Emperor awakening had always been terrifying, but the idea of him focusing was somehow worse. If a god locked in eternal suffering turned even the smallest shard of awareness toward the galaxy. Why? Toward what? Toward whom? A distant thunder rolled across the sky. Not weather, not atmosphere. Warp thunder. The sign of something immense, shifting far beyond mortal sight. The overseer straightened, her expression grim. This is no longer a local disturbance. We need answers. Reports. Signals. Anything. Her words were steady, but her eyes betrayed the truth. We were far past simple answers. And the next echo, whenever it came, would not be gentle. Chapter 3. The veil trembles. By the time the sun reached its frail peak above the settlement, the air had changed again. Not with another pulse, nor with another psychic tremor, but with something subtler, an unease that clung to the skin like ash. People moved through the streets not as survivors, but as witnesses, carrying the weight of an experience they could neither articulate nor deny. The world felt suspended, caught in a pause between breaths, and every sound seemed too loud against the fragile quiet. The overseer had summoned all available personnel to the central commissary, hoping to gather reports from across the region. But the Vox lines were dead. No messages, no signals, no distant chatter from neighboring outposts. Even the long-range relay tower, our thin lifeline to the wider Imperium, remained silent, its antenna sagging like the limb of a dying creature. The only noise that emerged from it now was a low, intermittent static that carried no pattern, no meaning, no hope. When we entered the commissary, the room was already crowded. Administratum scribes huddled over malfunctioning data slates, tapping at them in rhythmic desperation. Enforcers stood near the walls, gripping their shock mauls tighter than necessary. A pair of Medicae aides whispered frantically over a stretcher draped in sheets, though no one dared ask what, or who, lay beneath. The overseer climbed onto one of the overturned crates, near the front of the room. Even elevated, she looked smaller than usual, as though the morning's events had shaved something essential from her stature. But when she spoke, her voice carried with a clarity that cut through the exhausted murmurs. "We've received no contact from any outlying settlements," she announced. "No astropathic messages, no Vox transmissions, no courier signals. The region is isolated." An uneasy shiver ran through the room. Isolated. The word was a sentence in itself. One of the scribes raised a shaking hand. Could it be atmospheric interference? A dust storm? Solar activity? The overseer shook her head. If it were a natural disruption, the local cogitators would detect it. They show nothing. And the disturbances last night. She paused. Those were not caused by weather. A heavy silence followed. The technician who had been beside me through the earlier events stepped forward. "The machines are still wrong," he said. "The haulers, the loaders, even some of the power relays. They're responding to stimuli that shouldn't exist, as if receiving signals from outside their programming." "From where?" someone asked. He hesitated. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it feels the same as what hit the servitor." A murmur rippled through the room. I stepped forward, feeling the air tighten around my throat. The Skitarii weren't reacting to atmospheric signals. They were reacting to the Astronomican. The overseer's eyes flicked to mine, sharp, acknowledging, unsettled. A voice from the back whispered, "If the Astronomican is faltering, then navigators." Another voice finished the thought, trembling. "Ships will be blind in the warp." The implications spread like cracks in glass. If the Astronomican's resonance was shifting, if psychers were collapsing, if machines were fluttering under impossible pressure, then what was happening across the Imperium? What were navigators seeing in the warp? What distant fleets were drifting, lost without guidance, whose prayers now reached only silence? Before anyone could voice such fears aloud, a sudden clang reverberated through the commissary, metal striking stone, sharp enough to freeze every breath. We turned toward the sound. A scribe had dropped his data slate, not out of clumsiness, out of shock. He pointed toward the far wall, where a large Auspex panel was mounted. Its screen flickered. Lines of green code jittered across the display, forming patterns that resembled neither words nor data. The glow brightened, oscillating like a heartbeat. Then the signal resolved into something clearer. A waveform. A single, repeating pulse. Too perfect to be random. Too slow to be machine. Too steady to be a malfunction. The room held its breath. The waveform pulsed again. Softly. Deliberately. The overseer approached the panel, as though nearing a sacred relic. "Is this from the relay tower?" she asked. "No," a scribe whispered. "It's not coming from any tower." "Then what's the source?" He swallowed hard. "The Auspex thinks it's coming from orbit." The whisper tore through the room, like a blade. Something in orbit. Something broadcasting a pulse identical to the one that brushed our minds the night before. But that made no sense. There were no Imperial ships scheduled to pass near this world. No patrols. No astropathic transmissions strong enough to create a physical signal. The waveform pulsed again. And this time something inside my chest tightened. Not with fear, but with recognition. The same instinctual recognition that had frozen every living soul under the glow of the horizon. A feeling that didn't come from the body, but from the mind. From the part of the mind that brushed against the warp without ever meaning to. "He's reaching farther," I whispered. The overseer turned toward me, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" I steadied my breath. "He's not waking, not moving, not speaking." A pause. But his presence is shifting, expanding, like a lantern flaring in a dark room. "Why now?" someone asked. The question lingered like the echo of a scream. The waveform pulsed again. The air grew colder. And somewhere beyond our skies, beyond our world, beyond our understanding, the veil between the warp and the waking galaxy trembled with the pressure of a mind that had not stirred in 10,000 years, but was stirring now. Not awake, not yet, but watching. The waveform continued its steady pulse, each rhythm settling into the marrow like a distant drumbeat. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The Auspex should not have been receiving anything from orbit, certainly not a signal strong enough to bleed through corrupted machinery and psychic residue. Yet the pulse persisted, unwavering, indifferent to the terror it cast across the room. The overseer leaned closer to the screen, her breath fogging against the cracked surface. "Increase the filter resolution," she ordered. A scribe obeyed, fingers trembling as he manipulated the damaged control panel. The waveform sharpened. Lines thickened. The faint static softened as the Auspex strained to refine the signal. Then the pulse changed. Not in strength. Its power remained steady, but in shape. The smooth, curved lines of the waveform twisted into jagged peaks, then reformed, then twisted again. It was not random. It was trying to convey something. A pattern. A message. A presence pressing through the limitations of human-made machinery. One of the Medicae aides stepped backward, shaking her head. "This is impossible. This kind of modulation requires intent." The technician murmured, "It's not modulation. It's reflection." The overseer turned sharply. "Explain." He swallowed. "Last night, everything, from machinery to psychers, reacted because something brushed against reality from the warp. But this," he gestured toward the screen, "this isn't the warp pushing into matter. This is matter echoing something in the warp, like a mirror that suddenly began to reflect something too immense to fit inside it." A chilling silence followed. The waveform flickered. Then it began to rise slowly, steadily, like a resonance building toward a crescendo. A scribe whispered, "It's synchronizing with something." "With what?" someone asked. No one answered. I felt the sensation return, not as overwhelming as the pulse the night before, but just as unmistakable. A subtle tightening behind the eyes, a pressure at the base of the skull, a faint, cold whisper threading through the bones like a psychic draft. A ripple swept through the commissary as others felt it too. Some shivered, some cursed under their breath. A few pressed their palms to their temples. The waveform reached its peak. Then suddenly it stopped. The screen went black. The lights flickered overhead. A low hum rolled through the air, like a distant choir, singing a note held too long. And then every lumen strip in the room flared to blinding white. I staggered back, covering my eyes as the world dissolved into brilliance. Voices cried out. A tray clattered to the floor. Someone shouted a prayer. Someone else screamed. When the light finally dimmed, the room was bathed in a sickly, pallid glow. The Auspex panel flickered back to life. Only now the screen displayed not a waveform, but an image. A shape. Distant, blurred, yet unmistakably real. It looked like a ship. Derelict. Silent. Hanging in orbit like a corpse suspended above the world. But it wasn't Imperial. And it wasn't Xenos. It was something else. A vessel of impossible angles. Twisted yet symmetrical. Ancient yet intact. Its hull glowed faintly with the same resonance that had pulsed from the Astronomican the night before. Not a beacon. Not a distress signal. An echo. A reflection of the warp storm that had brushed against the Emperor's fractured awareness. Whispers filled the commissary. What is that? It can't be real. Is it a manifestation? Is it warp-born? The overseer's face turned ashen. Enhance the image. The scribe tried, but the Auspex resisted. The moment he attempted to refine the resolution, the screen flared with violent static, and the panel hissed with burning ozone. It doesn't want us to see it, he whispered. Not doesn't want to be seen. Doesn't want us to see it. A shiver crawled along my spine. The technician whispered the thought none of us wanted to speak aloud. What if it's not a ship at all? The overseer shot him a sharp glare. Then what? He swallowed hard. What if it's thought? A projection. A bleed-through of something the Emperor touched when he stirred. My mouth went dry. The idea seemed impossible, blasphemous even, but so did everything else we had witnessed. And the shape on the screen. It did not obey the rules of physical architecture. Its edges seemed to bend around themselves, as if the Auspex were struggling to force something immaterial into a comprehensible frame. The image flickered again. For a heartbeat, just a single, impossible moment, the blur resolved into perfect clarity, and I saw eyes. Not human, not Xenos, not alive. Eyes like windows into a consciousness so vast it could not fit within matter. Eyes that saw through the veil of the warp and into reality without distinction. Then the screen shattered. Glass burst outward in a spray of sharp fragments. People ducked. Someone cried out as a shard sliced their arm. Sparks rained from the exposed wiring. Smoke curled upward from the ruined panel. The overseer stared at the smoldering wreckage, her face pale. It's not only the Astronomican that's trembling, she whispered. The veil itself is thinning. The room felt colder, smaller, too quiet. I met her gaze. What does that mean for us? She hesitated, a long, fragile moment. It means, she said softly, that whatever the Emperor touched when he stirred is touching back. And somewhere far above the world, hidden behind the thinning veil, something immense shifted again. Slow, deliberate, awake enough to know we existed, and watching. The smoke hadn't even cleared from the shattered Auspex before the next tremor rippled through the air. Not a physical shudder of stone or metal, but a psychic pressure that pressed against the mind like a cold hand closing around the skull. It rolled over us in a slow wave, bending thought, tightening breath. Those nearest to the broken screen staggered back, clutching their temples. A scribe collapsed to his knees, muttering fragmented prayers. Someone whispered my name, but the sound warped and stretched, as though passing through water. The overseer steadied herself against a pillar, eyes narrowing with grim resolve. The veil is unstable, she said, though her voice was thin, strained. Whatever's behind it, it's pushing through. Her words vibrated in the charged air, and then the lights flickered again, 3 sharp pulses, each accompanied by a spike of psychic tension. On the third pulse, somewhere deep within the settlement, a child screamed. Then another. Then another. A rising chain of terrified cries that spread with terrifying speed. The overseer spun toward the door. Outside. Now. We ran. The commissary door slammed open to a world steeped in unnatural silence. The sky had darkened, not with clouds, but with a faint, shimmering pall that spread like a translucent membrane across the heavens. It reminded me of the distortion we'd seen earlier, but thicker now, more substantial, like a curtain stretched too tightly. People filled the streets, but none of them moved with purpose or direction. They wandered in disoriented circles, muttering to themselves, staring at the sky, clutching their heads as if trying to keep something from spilling out. Others stood completely still, faces lifted in blank awe or horror. The air smelled of cold iron and ozone. Then I heard it. A hum. Low. Resonant. Not from machines. Not from any physical source. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It vibrated through bone and thought alike. The technician beside me stumbled, nearly falling. "It's harmonizing," he gasped. "The warp and reality, they're harmonizing." A phrase I had never wanted to hear. Harmonization was not unity. It was intrusion, warp stuff pressing against the barrier of real space with intention, with presence, with hunger or awareness or both. The hum deepened. A woman near the well clasped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I can hear it," she sobbed. "I can hear him breathing." Her husband grabbed her shoulders. Who is breathing?" She opened her eyes, wide, unblinking, pupils dilated so far they nearly swallowed the iris. Him. A collective shiver moved through those who heard her. I felt my own heartbeat stutter. The overseer pushed forward into the street, shouting for order, but her voice could not pierce the hum. People didn't look at her. They didn't look at anything. They were listening to something no mortal was meant to hear. I pushed past a group of trembling workers and stepped into the wide square near the Vox Tower. The tower itself hummed with the same resonance, its metal frame vibrating as though someone were plucking invisible strings within its structure. Then, without warning, the hum sharpened. Not louder, more focused, as if the entire world had been placed beneath a lens. A wind swept through the square, though the air remained unnaturally cold. Dust spiraled upward in unnatural patterns, forming loose columns that twisted and dissipated before reforming again. My stomach churned with a sensation I could not name, vertigo mixed with dread. The sky rippled. The pall across the heavens grew brighter, tinged with faint gold. Not warm gold, cold gold, the color of something sacred glimpsed through fractured memory. People gasped. Some cried out. Others simply stared, their mouths open in silent awe. The technician whispered beside me, "The Astronomican." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The light in the sky pulsed. Once, twice, a third time. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. The overseer turned toward me, her face pale, eyes reflecting the impossible glow. "This is not the throne," she whispered. "It can't be. The Emperor's light has never manifested like this. Not outside the warp. Not in real space." She looked back at the sky, voice trembling. "So what are we seeing?" I stared upward. The golden pall thinned. The veil shuddered. And for a fraction of a breath, a moment so brief it might have been a hallucination, something immense pressed against the fabric of reality. Not a shape. Not a face. Something for which mortal senses had no language. But my mind reacted before I could. I dropped to one knee, not from pain, but from pressure, like gravity itself had spiked. Tears blurred my vision. My breath came fast and shallow. A single thought, not a word, not a voice, but a thought, brushed the edge of my awareness. Not communication, not intention, recognition. A presence acknowledging our existence with the same distant, incomprehensible curiosity with which a star might notice the orbiting dust around it. Then it was gone. The sky dimmed. The pall dissipated. The hum faded into silence. People collapsed throughout the square, some sobbing, others gasping, others sitting in stunned quiet. The overseer stood frozen beside me, eyes wide, lips parted. "He saw us," she whispered. She turned toward me, and in her expression I finally saw something deeper than fear. Understanding. "This isn't just an echo," she said. "The Emperor's dreams aren't bleeding into the warp." Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "The warp is bleeding into his dreams." And for the first time, we realized the truth. Something on the far side of the veil was not just reacting to him. It was approaching him. The moment the presence receded, the world seemed to sag, as though every structure, every stone, every living thing had been holding itself rigid in anticipation of a moment that none of us could name. And now that it had passed, exhaustion set in like a fever. People slumped against walls, sank to the ground, or leaned on one another without shame or hesitation. Even the air felt tired, thin, overused. I rose slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. The overseer did the same, though her breaths came in shallow, uneven pulls. For a long moment she simply stared at the sky, complexion pale as star-bleached bone. When she finally lowered her gaze, her eyes carried a weight I had never seen in her before, something like grief wrapped in realization. "The veil is thinning," she said, almost to herself, "and whatever is behind it is letting us feel it." "Why now?" I asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was the question burning in every mind across the settlement, a question as vast as the void itself. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the Vox Tower, placing her hand against its vibrating metal frame. Even now it emitted a faint, residual hum, like a machine remembering something it had no right to remember. "This is too precise to be chance," she finally murmured. "The distortion isn't random. The pulses aren't random. The synchronizations, the harmonics, the reflections, none of this just happens." A quiet voice behind us added, "And nothing pushes through the veil unless something on our side weakens." We turned. Lyra, the young astropath who had whispered of unbearable brightness earlier, stood on unsteady legs in the doorway of the commissary. Her bandaged eyes looked hollowed, the skin beneath them sunken. But she was awake, calm, and utterly changed. The overseer moved toward her, helping her step down onto the square. "You shouldn't be standing." Lyra managed a faint smile, fragile, trembling. "I shouldn't be alive either. But the warp did not take me. It merely showed me something." Her head tilted upward, bandaged sockets aimed toward the sky, as if she could still see the thinning veil with some deeper sense. "What did you see?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "At first, I thought it was the Emperor's light, bright and immeasurable. But then the brightness fractured. Not dimmed. Fractured, as if something touched the edges of his presence and reflected it back with difference." "Difference," the technician echoed. She nodded. "A difference that does not belong to him. A resonance that mimics his light, but is not his light. Familiar yet foreign. Close yet impossibly far." The overseer stiffened. "Are you saying something is imitating the Astronomican?" "No," Lyra shook her head slowly. "Not imitating. Aligning." The square went still. A man nearby whispered, "What does that mean? Aligning with the Emperor? With his dreams?" Lyra's voice grew thinner, stretched by exhaustion. "I only know what I felt. He stirs in a realm no living mind should see. And something within that realm, something ancient and vast, shifted as he shifted, like two tides meeting in the dark." Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, and when they touched, the ripple struck us all. The technician swallowed hard. "If the Emperor is dreaming, and something in the warp dreams back." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We all felt the cold truth beneath the thought. Lyra stepped closer to me, her voice lowering. "You felt it too, didn't you? That moment when the veil brushed your thoughts, when something recognized you." I nodded before I could think. It wasn't pride. It wasn't fear. It was simply acknowledgement of something I could not rationally deny. Her breath trembled. It wasn't him recognizing us. Not directly. Something else looked through him. The words hit harder than any tremor. Something else. Something that could look through the Emperor's presence, or rather, through the fragmented psychic storm that surrounded him. The overseer exhaled sharply. We need answers from the Imperium. Reports. Astropathic confirmation. Anything. Lyra shook her head faintly. You won't receive any. Not yet. Why? The overseer demanded. Because the veil is not thinning everywhere, Lyra whispered. Not evenly. But where it thins, she lifted her trembling hand toward the sky. The warp looks back. A cold wind swept through the square, cutting through clothing and skin alike. It carried no sand, no dust, only the lingering hum of a presence far beyond mortal comprehension. The overseer straightened, resolve hardening her expression. If the warp is aligning with the Emperor's dreams, if something else is interfering, the Ecclesiarchy must know. The Adeptus Astrotelepathica must know. The Imperial fleets. None of them can see this yet, Lyra said, voice soft but certain. This is the first place where the veil cracked. And do you know why? The overseer asked. No. Lyra turned her head slightly, toward me. But he might. A chill sliced through my spine. The technician stared at me, confusion etched across his face. The overseer looked at me with something sharper, curiosity sharpened by necessity. I opened my mouth to speak, but no answer came. Not because I had none, but because I felt something shift, deep inside my thoughts, subtle as breath. Not an intrusion, a pull, small, inescapable, as though some part of me had been brushed by that vast presence a second time, and recognized. The sky flickered, only once, but we all saw it. The veil trembled again, subtle, thin as silk, but undeniable. Lyra's voice barely rose above a whisper. It's not finished. A distant thunder rolled across the horizon, warp thunder, soft, muted, but growing. The overseer's jaw tightened. Then we brace for the next wave. But Lyra shook her head with quiet dread. There will be no wave this time. She lifted her face to the sky. This time it will be a voice. A hush fell over the world as the realization dawned. The next echo would not be sensation. It would be intention. Chapter 4. Songs of Rumor and Revelation. The hours that followed felt stretched thin, fragile, as though reality itself struggled to remember the shape it was meant to hold. The settlement did not return to normal, because normal had dissolved the moment the veil shuddered, and the Emperor's fractured dreaming brushed the minds of mortals. Instead, a strange quiet settled over everything. Not calm, never calm, but the brittle silence that precedes the next tremor of a world poised on the edge of revelation. People whispered in clusters, avoiding the open spaces as if the sky might descend upon them again. Some prayed with fierce desperation, clutching worn icons and rosaries. Others paced in aimless loops, muttering half-coherent thoughts as though trying to anchor themselves in sanity by the act of constant movement. But the most unsettling were those who did nothing at all, those who stood staring, hollow-eyed, at nothing, as though still listening for a sound that had not yet arrived. The overseer called an emergency gathering within the manufactorum's assembly hall, the largest structure still standing. The place felt wrong to me now. I kept seeing the twitching servitor in every shadow, hearing its broken attempt at a word it was never meant to form. Yet the hall filled regardless. People needed direction, even if the overseer had little to give. As we waited for her to speak, fragments of rumor drifted through the crowd, like drifting ash. Some heard chanting from the mountain pass. No humans live there. My sister's boy said the ground glowed under his feet. Glowed. A pilgrim swears he saw wings in the sky, golden wings spanning the clouds. An old man says the Emperor's spirit is rising. Someone else said it's a sign of doom. No one dismissed these whispers. Not now. The veil had shown us that reality had more seams than any of us dared admit. If the Astronomican could flicker here, if something could align with it, then the old stories no longer felt distant or metaphorical. They felt near. Too near. The overseer stepped onto an elevated platform, her posture rigid, her face drawn tight. She waited for quiet. Not that her presence commanded silence, but because the fear in the room made silence heavy, inevitable. We have received no transmission from any Imperial authority, she began, voice steady despite the tension. No Vox signal. No astropathic whisper. Nothing from orbit. Our world remains cut off. A low murmur rippled through those gathered. The overseer raised a hand for calm. But we are not alone in this. Everyone here felt the pulses, the pressure, the presence. That means the disturbance is not confined to psychers or machinery. It affects all of us, indiscriminately. Is it heresy? Someone whispered too loudly. A few heads turned sharply. But the overseer shook her head. This is not heresy. It is a phenomenon, one we cannot yet understand. And speculation will only breed more fear. Yet even as she said it, speculation bloomed again. Some say this is the Emperor calling to us. Some say he is breaking free. Some say the throne is failing. A man near the back laughed bitterly. Breaking free? From what? From death? From 10,000 years of agony? Don't fool yourselves. If he wakes, the galaxy will burn. The overseer glared at him, and he fell silent, but the words lingered like smoke. Lyra stood near the front, leaning heavily on a railing. Her bandaged eyes turned toward the overseer, as though she could still see her through the cloth. When she spoke, her voice carried in a way that made the entire hall fall into a deeper quiet. I have heard something since the tremor, she said softly. Not words, not images, but tones. A pattern, a presence shaping itself. What presence? Someone demanded, not accusatory but desperate. She shook her head. It is not the Emperor. Not directly. His presence is a fire. Too bright, too immense. This is like the reflection of a flame against a sheet of glass. Not the fire itself, but something near it. Cold dread crawled up my spine. You mean something in the warp? The overseer said. Something close to him. Something watching him. Lyra whispered. The room tightened with fear. The technician stepped forward. But why here? Why our world? Why now? Lyra hesitated. Her breathing grew strained. Because this world has thin places. Wounds. Places where the warp bleeds through the cracks. And when the Emperor stirred even slightly, those wounds widened. And now? The overseer asked. Lyra's bandaged eyes tilted upward as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. Now, she whispered. The warp sings. A tremor passed through the room. Not physical, but emotional. A tension that tightened every throat and clenched every jaw. Sings what? Someone whispered. She lowered her head. Revelation. Or warning. I cannot tell. The overseer exhaled slowly. We need to prepare. For what? I don't yet know. But something else is coming, and we cannot face it ignorant. Her eyes swept the room. Search the archives. Collect every scrap of astropathic lore. Record every rumor, every vision, every malfunction. No detail is too small. The Imperium has survived this long because we face the unknown with knowledge, not fear. But even as she said it, I sensed her doubt. Knowledge could only go so far when the warp itself bent closer. And though the veil had closed for the moment, every instinct told me it was not retreating. It was gathering. The way a storm gathers strength, just beyond the horizon. The way a voice gathers breath before speaking. The manufactorum hall emptied into a cautious murmur of bodies and footfalls, but few dared stray far. People lingered in doorways or clustered in tight circles, whispering as though afraid the sky itself might overhear them. The overseer remained at the platform a moment longer, her eyes following the movement of the crowd with a gaze sharpened by fear she refused to show. Lyra stood with her head slightly tilted, listening to something no one else could hear, her breath catching at intervals like a candle guttering in an unseen draft. I stepped out into the open air with the technician beside me. The afternoon light lay flat and diluted across the settlement, as if stripped of its warmth. A dust haze drifted lazily from the outskirts, carrying faint metallic taste on the wind. The horizon remained still, but the stillness felt staged, like a backdrop stretched over something restless beneath. Then the rumors began spreading faster than the wind. A group of workers hurried past us, their lanterns swaying against their chests. One of them recognized me and slowed just long enough to breathe out a fragment of something half-believed. They say the miners in the northern shaft saw glyphs burning on the stone, symbols that weren't there before. He didn't wait for a response. The others followed in quick steps, heads down, moving with the instinct of those who hope distance from their own words might keep them safe. More voices layered through the streets as we walked. A pilgrim said he heard chanting under the earth, voices that were out of sync with human breath. They found a data slate writing its own words in the shrine. No one touched it. It just started scribing prayers. They say a custodian ship was seen near Terra 3 nights ago, then vanished. They say the Adeptus Astrotelepathica sealed 3 whole towers. No explanation. Rumor. Fear. Interpretation. But no matter how wild the claims became, no one laughed. Every whisper now carried the weight of possibility. The kind of possibility that could fracture a world. The technician let out a shaky breath. None of this can be verified, but people are treating it like truth. Because something is happening, I said. Something bigger than us. Bigger than this world. He nodded, swallowing hard. Then we need to find patterns in these stories. There has to be a reason this world is experiencing the veil first. We turned down the narrow path leading to the settlement's archives, a squat stone structure carved from the remnants of an old bunker. Its doors hung slightly crooked, warped by decades of heat and dust. Inside, dim lumen strips flickered against shelves stacked with binders, scrolls, cracked data crystals, administratum ledgers, the painstaking attempts of 1,000 petty custodians to make sense of a world that had never cared to explain itself. The overseer joined us a few moments later, brushing dust from her coat as she stepped inside. Start with anything referencing psi phenomena or warp resonance, she instructed the room. I want cross-comparisons, historical accounts, myths, anything that might help us form a picture. We're blind until we understand what we're facing. People scattered through the shelves, some with determination, others with fear masking itself behind purpose. Lyra entered last, her steps unsteady but deliberate. She moved without feeling her way, as though guided by instinct rather than sight. She ran her fingertips along the shelves until she found one that made her pause. "This one," she whispered. The overseer frowned. "What's in it?" "Old traveler records," I answered. "Pilgrim accounts. Logbooks. Stories from ships that passed through the system generations ago." Lyra nodded faintly. The warp remembers stories. Sometimes they echo. The technician pulled a cracked binder free from the shelf. Dust swirled as he opened it. Inside were brittle pages covered in faded script. Records of a passing pilgrim fleet. Ancient and weathered. "This is from 200 years ago," he murmured. "Read this." I leaned closer. The nights grew long, and the stars changed shape. Some among us claimed to dream of a great light behind a broken veil. A light that watched our souls, not with wrath, but with recognition. The tech priest said it was merely warp sickness, but the astropaths whispered something else. They whispered that his gaze had shifted, however briefly, toward the places where the realm of spirit thins. The words slammed into my chest. Recognition. Veil. Alignment. The overseer tightened her jaw. "This place has always been thin," Lyra whispered, "and thin places are where the first answers emerge." The technician flipped further through the binder. More scraps of record emerged. More myths. More mention of strange lights, psychic trembling, dreams shared across multiple minds. But one fragment caught Lyra's breath like a hook. They say the Emperor's dreaming casts shadows in the warp. And sometimes, only sometimes, something ancient stirs when he does. Some call it omen. Some call it reflection. Some call it hunger. Lyra shuddered. "That's what I felt," she whispered. "A shadow in his light. Not against him. Near him. Watching." The overseer closed the binder sharply. "We need facts, not superstition." But her voice lacked conviction. Outside, a sudden crack echoed across the settlement, like the sky splitting. We all froze. A low, resonant vibration followed. It coursed through the walls, the shelves, the stone under our feet. Lyra's breath hitched. "It's beginning again." The overseer looked to me, eyes narrowing with the weight of unspoken dread. "We're running out of time," she said, and the vibration deepened into a hum, smooth, cold, deliberate. A prelude. A gathering breath. The start of the voice she warned us about. The hum built with a slow, deliberate patience, that felt far more terrifying than any sudden shock. It rolled through the archives in a low resonance that rattled the shelves and sent dust drifting from overhead beams. Every person in the room froze where they stood, heads tilting upward as though some instinct older than memory commanded us to listen. Not one of us dared breathe too deeply. The air itself felt thinner, stretched taut around something unseen and approaching. The overseer was the first to move. She turned her head sharply toward Lyra, whose bandaged eyes were lifted toward the ceiling, chest rising and falling in shallow tremors. "Is it the same presence from before?" the overseer asked. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head as if trying to catch a frequency just beneath perception. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. "No," she whispered. "It's closer. Closer." The word seemed to land on everyone at once, and the fear in the room shifted. No longer a distant dread, but something immediate, pressing, unavoidable. The hum deepened again, vibrating through the shelves, through our bodies, through the marrow of the stone walls. The technician clutched the edge of a table, knuckles white. "This can't be happening again so soon. There's no pattern, no cycle." "There is," Lyra murmured, "but it isn't measured in time. It's measured in attention." The overseer stiffened. "Whose attention?" Lyra's head turned toward her, though the bandages hid her gaze. "Not his." A cold breath rippled through me. The shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the room, thickening as the hum swelled into something too large for the air to contain. It pressed against the mind like a presence, testing the edges of a sealed door, gentle, patient, horrifically curious. The overseer pointed toward the exit. "Everyone out. Move." Her voice was steady, but urgency sharpened the edges. People obeyed, stumbling toward the door, some covering their ears even though the hum wasn't loud. It was internal, resonant, vibrating in thought rather than sound. I stayed close to Lyra, guiding her as she walked with slow, uncertain steps. She flinched each time the hum shifted pitch, as though each fluctuation brushed a raw nerve. As we reached the doorway, she suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Wait." Her breath quickened. "It's forming. It's shaping itself." I didn't understand. "What is?" She turned her face slightly toward me. The voice. The hum ceased. Not faded, ceased. Cut away so abruptly the silence struck like a blow. Outside, the sky had dimmed to a muted iron shade, though the sun still hung above the horizon. People across the settlement stood transfixed again, staring upward, some trembling, some whispering, some silent with dread. The air carried no wind, no heat, no cold, only stillness so complete it felt manufactured. Then the voice came. It did not sound like a voice. Not at first. It began as a ripple, an almost imperceptible vibration that trembled through the dust at our feet, then through the air, then through the hollow space behind the eyes that mortal minds rarely touch. A sensation more than a sound, a pressure shaping itself into form. Somewhere nearby, a worker gasped and dropped to her knees. Another clutched at his temples. Someone cried out, "Not again, Emperor, protect us." Lyra lifted her face toward the sky. "It's not speaking to us," she whispered. "It's speaking through us." The resonance sharpened, and then, for the first time, it formed something that resembled a word, though no tongue had ever shaped it. The sound was fractured, layered, the harmonic of something far too vast to condense into mortal language. It scraped across perception like a blade dragged through glass, splintering thought with each syllable. The technician collapsed beside me, hands over his ears despite the futility. Blood trickled from his nose. A dozen others doubled over, retching. Only Lyra remained upright, trembling violently. "It's searching," she choked out. "It's searching for alignment, for recognition." "Recognition with what?" the overseer demanded. Lyra's answer was a whisper clawed from deep within her. "With the Emperor's dreaming." The voice surged, louder, clearer, more focused. A chorus of distorted tones that twisted themselves into a phrase with agonizing deliberation. A phrase that didn't belong in any tongue of man, Xenos, or demon. A phrase that carried the raw shape of meaning even as the meaning slipped through comprehension. And beneath the layered distortion, like an echo buried in the heartbeat of the warp, I felt a single, horrifying truth. It was calling. Not us. Him. The overseer grabbed my arm. We need shelter. Now. But before we could move, Lyra's knees buckled and she slumped against me, her voice cracking into a thin, broken whisper. He hears it. The world held its breath. The veil trembled once more, shivering like a thin membrane touched from both sides. Then, from beyond the sky, beyond the warp, beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension, the voice sounded again, clearer, closer, almost familiar, and I realized with a cold, sinking certainty. This was not a message. It was an invitation, and something was waiting for him to answer. The voice lingered in the air long after the resonance faded, as though the world itself still trembled from its passage. People collapsed across the settlement, some unconscious, some sobbing, some staring blankly into a horizon that suddenly felt far too close. The dust had not yet settled, and neither had the dread. It clung to the lungs like smoke, burned behind the ribs like swallowed fire. This time, the silence that followed was not merely absence, it was aftermath. I lowered Lyra gently to the ground. Her breathing came in quick, shallow bursts, each one strained as though her chest resisted the simple act of drawing air. Her bandaged eyes fluttered beneath the cloth, and her fingers flexed weakly at her sides. "Stay with us," I murmured. She exhaled a trembling breath. "I'm here." But the voice is still there. Not speaking, just waiting. The overseer knelt beside us, her face a tight mask. Waiting for what? Lyra tilted her head, her expression twisting with effort. For resonance. For alignment. It knows the Emperor is stirring. It knows his dreaming has rippled. It's trying to match the rhythm of his presence. Cold ran down my spine. And if it succeeds? I asked. Lyra's breath hitched. That I cannot see. The overseer stood, her boots crunching over gravel. The settlement stretched around us in disarray. Dozens of people sprawled across the ground, others staggering to their feet, some murmuring broken fragments of prayers. A few stared into the sky with an expression I'd seen only once before, when the veil cracked and the Emperor's fractured awareness brushed the living world. "We can't endure another pulse," the overseer said quietly. "Not like that. If it comes again, it could kill them. All of them." The technician pushed himself upright, wiping blood from his upper lip. If this voice aligns with his presence, even slightly, it could amplify through every psyker, every machine, every relay. We'd be drowned in it. "Unless we understand it first," the overseer replied. "How?" he demanded. She didn't answer. Not immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the manufactorum spire, the tallest structure in the settlement, jutting into the dim sky like a broken spear. Its long-dead Vox array glinted faintly in the pallid light. I knew that look. She wasn't seeing the spire. She was seeing a vantage point, a signal point, a place to study whatever waited above us. I stepped forward. "You're thinking of using the array?" "Yes," she said. "Even offline, its reflective dishes are intact. We might be able to catch the next ripple and interpret it before it hits the population at full strength." The technician recoiled. Interpret it? That wasn't a message. That was a presence forcing itself into minds, trying to shape itself into language. "That's why we need to analyze it," she insisted. "If we can map the pattern." "You can't map a god's whisper," he snapped. The overseer's eyes hardened. "Then we die ignorant. Choose." The technician looked away, but he said nothing more. The overseer turned to Lyra. "Can you walk?" Lyra nodded faintly, though her legs trembled beneath her. "I'll manage." "No," the overseer said. "You'll guide." Lyra's breath caught. "Guide what?" "Our understanding." Lyra shook her head weakly. "I am only an astropath. My sight is fractured. My mind is barely." "You survived contact with the veil when others fell," the overseer cut in. "You can hear what we cannot." Lyra hesitated. Hearing it again could break me. The overseer knelt beside her, voice softening. "You said the voice wasn't speaking to us. Only through us. That means you may not be its target. That gives you an advantage no instrument in this settlement has." Lyra's mouth trembled. or it makes me a conduit. It was the quietest fear she had voiced since this began, and the most honest. But after a moment of silence, she nodded. "I'll go," she whispered. The overseer stood again, turning toward the rest of us. "All of you who can move, prepare the path to the spire. Clear debris, secure the ascent routes. We need the highest point ready before the next pulse." People stirred, some reluctantly, others with grim determination. Fear had carved us hollow, but action was the only salve left. I remained beside Lyra as she steadied herself on trembling legs. "Are you sure?" I asked. She tilted her head, not toward me, but toward the sky. "This presence, whatever it is, it's not hostile. Not yet. Curious. Seeking. But if it aligns fully with him, even by accident," she shivered, "the Imperium has never known what that would mean. And we're the first to feel it," I said. She nodded. "Thin places always speak first." We stepped forward together, following the overseer through the fractured streets. The spire loomed ahead, a broken tower etched against a sky that no longer felt like sky at all. The air hummed with faint residual energy, as though the world waited for the next breath of something vast beyond its edge. As we approached the base, the technician exhaled shakily. "If this voice synchronizes with his dreaming again, will it speak more clearly?" Lyra's reply was soft as dying light. "Yes." "And what happens then?" he asked. Lyra paused, her bandaged eyes lifting toward the heavens. "Then revelation becomes reality." A distant roll of warp thunder answered her. The overseer clenched her jaw. "Everyone inside. We make for the array." The spire doors groaned open, and as we crossed the threshold, the thin veil above the world quivered again, subtle, trembling, like lips parting before uttering the next word of a sentence too vast for mortal language. The voice had only just begun. Chapter 5, When the Galaxy Holds Its Breath. The ascent through the Manufactorum spire felt less like climbing a tower, and more like threading our way through the ribs of a dying colossus. Metal groaned beneath our boots. Dust drifted from overhead beams in thin, trembling curtains. Every step echoed too loudly, as though the hollow structure had become an amplifier for our fear. The higher we climbed, the tighter the air felt, charged with the residue of warp-touched resonance, still lingering like a faint electrical sting. The overseer led the way, her lamp cutting a narrow path through the dim interior. The technician followed behind her, muttering half-formed calculations under his breath, as though math alone could build a barrier between us and whatever waited beyond the veil. Lyra and I brought up the rear. She leaned heavily on the railings, but her steps were steady, guided not by sight, but by an instinct that seemed to sharpen the closer we came to the tower's peak. We reached a narrow landing just below the array chamber. The air here felt different, thinner, sharper, as though saturated with echoes from the sky. The overseer paused, scanning the rusted hatch above us. "This is it," she murmured. "Once we're inside, brace yourselves. If another pulse comes while we're exposed." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. We all knew the risk. She forced the hatch open. A rush of cold air swept down, carrying with it a faint hum, steady, pulsing, almost inaudible. Lyra froze, head tilting upward as though listening to a distant choir. "It's gathering again," she whispered. We emerged into the array chamber. It was a circular space, open to the sky through a wide, shattered aperture at its center. The old Vox dishes leaned at broken angles, their surfaces pitted by years of storms. Strands of torn cabling hung like dead vines from ceiling supports. The world beyond stretched in a vast, muted panorama, gray ridges, dust-blown plains, and the faint outline of distant ruins half swallowed by the haze. But it was the sky that held us still. The veil was thinner here, almost visible. A trembling, translucent shimmer stretched across the heavens, faint as breath on glass, quivering with threads of pale gold that pulsed like veins beneath skin. The air felt alive beneath it, cold, taut, expectant. The technician sank to one knee beside a fallen control console, brushing dust from its panels. "If I can reroute the dish's focus and map the resonance." A sudden tremor shook the spire. Not physical, psychic. A pressure brushed the back of my skull, soft, searching, like fingers grazing the surface of thought. I staggered, gripping a rusted beam to steady myself. Lyra gasped. It's here. The overseer spun. The pulse. No, Lyra shook her head, trembling. Not a pulse. A presence. It's above us. We turned our eyes skyward. The shimmer rippled. Not outward. Downward. As though something vast had drawn closer on the far side of the veil. Leaning in. Pressing against the membrane of real space, like a colossal mind curious about the flicker it had felt in the dream of a god. The technician scrambled to activate the dish. Sparks spat from the console. Come on, just stabilize, just align. Lyra stepped toward the aperture, her face lifted like one listening to a distant hymn. It's reaching, she whispered. Not with words, with intent. The shimmer brightened. A low resonance flowed through the air, far quieter than before, but infinitely more focused. It vibrated through the metal plates beneath our feet, through the beams overhead, through breath and blood and bone. The wind stilled. Dust froze midair. For one suspended heartbeat, all sound died. Then the voice formed. Not a sound, not a whisper, not even the fractured symphony we'd felt before. A thought, pure, direct, unmistakably aware. It passed through us like a wave of cold light, illuminating every fear we'd tried to bury, every question we hadn't dared ask. My knees buckled under its weight. The overseer gripped a railing, teeth clenched against the pressure. The technician collapsed fully, clutching his head. Only Lyra remained upright, though her entire body trembled. Her lips parted. It knows him, she whispered. It knows the Emperor's dreaming. It has touched the edges of his presence before. Touched, not opposed, not aligned, not subservient. Touched, as equals touch across a vast chasm. Another pulse of thought washed over us, cold and ancient, carrying emotion so immense it shredded into fragments inside the mortal mind. Recognition, longing, memory, hunger, curiosity. The overseer gasped. What does it want? Lyra lifted her face to the trembling veil. It wants him to wake. Ice pooled in my chest. Why? I asked. Lyra swallowed hard. Because if he wakes, the veil will split. A fracture in reality. A flood of warp light. A storm that could drown the galaxy. The technician let out a choking breath. That would destroy us. All of us. The entire Imperium. Lyra shook her head. No, she said. Not destroy. She turned toward us, voice barely a whisper. Transform. The veil above us rippled violently. The presence surged closer, and the final echo began. The veil convulsed as if something colossal pressed its weight against it, testing the boundary between realms with slow, inexorable pressure. Dust lifted from the floor in delicate spirals, drawn upward by currents that did not belong to wind. My breath hitched as the air thinned, stretched, then vibrated with frequencies my ears couldn't hear, but my skull could feel. The sky above the array shimmered like disturbed water, light bending along the curvature of something trying to breach through. The technician's console flickered in frantic bursts. The dish is reading everything, he choked out. Every frequency, every spectrum. It's not a signal, it's a presence saturating the entire range. The overseer crouched beside him, gripping a railing to stay upright. Stabilize it, she ordered. I can't stabilize something that isn't meant to fit inside mortal instruments, he shouted, desperation cracking his voice. Another pulse rolled through us, quiet, but sharp, like the sting of a blade drawn lightly across the mind. I bit down on a cry as my vision doubled. Metal groaned around us, warping under psychic force. The spire was old, too old to endure this. Lyra stood at the center of the chamber, her hands trembling at her sides. Her face was lifted toward the sky, her breath soft and uneven. The bandages over her eyes fluttered in the charged air. It's aligning, she whispered. Closer, closer than before. The overseer steadied herself. Lyra, what is it? Not the Emperor. What is the other presence? Lyra shook her head slowly, not in denial, in awe. I cannot name it. No language made by man can. Her voice cracked with strain. But it is old, older than our memories, older than the scars of the Heresy. It dwells deep in the currents of the warp, far beyond demons, far beyond gods of madness. It does not seek worship. It does not seek dominion. Then what does it seek? The overseer pressed. Lyra's lips parted. Witness. The word hung in the air like a drawn blade. Another pulse surged through us. Stronger now, sharper. The spire swayed, metal screaming. Sparks spat from the consoles. The technician cried out as a burst of feedback knocked him sideways. The presence pressed harder against the veil, and the veil pressed back, shuddering, trembling, fraying at the edges. Threads of pale gold spidered across the sky, each one pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of a heart far older than humanity. Then, a crack. Not physical, not audible. A crack in perception. A splitting of the boundary that kept the warp from swallowing us whole. A sliver of what lay beyond squeezed through. The world dimmed. The air thinned further. A cold pressure sank into my chest, pushing against my lungs until I couldn't breathe. I dropped to one knee, gasping, clawing at the floor. The overseer collapsed beside a pillar, teeth gritted against the psychic weight. Lyra didn't fall, but her legs trembled violently, and her hands lifted toward the sky as though drawn by invisible threads. Her voice spilled out in a hoarse whisper. It seized the Emperor's dreams, the way a drowning soul sees light beyond the surface, and it reaches for him. A horrifying realization curled through me. It wants him awake, I rasped, but not for our sake. Lyra nodded weakly. No, not for us. Then for what? The overseer demanded through clenched teeth. For reunion, Lyra whispered. For the memory of a bond older than our world, older than Terra, older than the Imperium. The technician looked up, face pale. Reunion with what? With whom? Before Lyra could answer, the presence pushed again. Harder. The veil tore open in a line of burning gold, thin as a hair, bright as a newborn sun. Not wide, not catastrophic, but enough to send pain lancing through every mind in the settlement. I screamed without sound. The air burned cold. My vision went white at the edges. The tear pulsed once, twice, and through that sliver of impossible brilliance, I felt him, not as a god, not as a living corpse upon the throne, not as the beacon of the Astronomican, but as a presence caught between dreaming and waking, between death and eternity. A presence turning toward the fracture, turning toward us. The veil slammed shut. The world snapped back. I collapsed onto the metal floor, shaking, breath ragged. The overseer retched against the wall. The technician gasped like a drowning man finding air. Lyra fell to her knees. She pressed both hands to the floor, as though grounding herself against the weight of what she'd felt. When she spoke, her voice was a hollow echo of itself. It almost reached him. Silence settled like ash. Lyra lifted her head. If that tear had opened wider, the galaxy would have felt his stirring. The overseer wiped blood from her lip. Would the Imperium survive it? Lyra shook her head. Survive? No. A pause. And, no. Her breath trembled. It would change. She turned her bandaged eyes toward the sky. And the warp is waiting for that change. The spire felt different after the tear snapped shut, hollowed out, as though something essential had been scraped from its walls. The air trembled with a faint echo, the dying hum of a presence that had retreated but not gone. We lay scattered across the chamber, bruised by forces no mortal body was meant to endure. Lyra knelt motionless in the center, fingertips brushing the metal floor, as if trying to decipher the residue left behind. For a long, breathless stretch of moments, none of us spoke. The overseer was the first to rise. She pressed a hand against one of the support beams, steadying herself. Her breath came ragged, but her voice was iron. We're leaving, she said. Now. The spire can't take another surge, and the next one might not just be resonance. The technician staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his nose. The array recorded nothing, he said helplessly. Absolutely nothing. It's as if the presence burned through the instruments before they even began to register anything. That presence wasn't meant to be recorded, I muttered. He looked at me, eyes wide and hollow. Then what did it want? Lyra finally lifted her head. To be seen. she whispered, just as it saw us. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with something deeper, reverence and terror braided together. The overseer stepped toward her. You said it was a reunion, a memory. If this presence has touched him before, if it knows the Emperor's dreaming, then what is it? Lyra inhaled sharply, as though the answer itself carried weight. I don't know its name, she said, but I felt its age. It predates the first warp storms. It isn't one of the gods. It isn't a demon. It isn't anything the Imperium catalogs. She swallowed. It's something that existed in the warp long before faith gave shape to terror. The technician's face paled. Then why does it care about him? Lyra closed her eyes behind the bandages. Because the Emperor is the only mind in the galaxy vast enough to hear it. A silence heavier than gravity settled over us. Then the ground shuddered again, but this time, not from psychic force. A physical tremor rattled the spire, sending dust cascading from the rafters. What was that? The overseer demanded. The technician bolted to the aperture, looking out across the horizon. The color drained from his face. You need to see this, he whispered. We rushed to the opening. Below us, the settlement writhed with movement. People staggered through the streets, clutching their heads or crawling on hands and knees. The hum had left them dazed and trembling. But the true horror lay beyond the settlement itself. The sky was changing. The faint shimmering veil, once subtle, barely visible, now hung across the heavens like a vast sheet of fractured glass. Cracks of gold spidered outward from where the tear had formed, glowing with faint luminescence. They pulsed softly, in a rhythm disturbingly similar to the Astronomican's beat, but out of sync. Just slightly. Just enough to feel wrong. The overseer's breath caught. It's destabilizing. No, Lyra said, her voice thin. It's preparing. For what? I asked. For the next attempt. The spire lurched again, groaning in protest. The technician braced himself against a beam. The warp and real space aren't meant to touch like this. If that presence tears through again, the whole region could be swallowed by storm fronts. And if the Emperor responds? I asked quietly. Lyra flinched as though the question itself wounded her. Then the tear won't be small this time. I felt cold inside. Not fear, something deeper. A hollowed-out awareness that we were witnessing something no human was meant to see. Something that belonged in myth and forbidden scripture, not in the dry dust of a forgotten outpost. We have to warn someone, the technician said. Anyone. We need to reach orbit, reach another world, anything. There's no contact, the overseer reminded him. We are alone. A new tremor rippled across the sky. The golden cracks brightened. Lyra's fingers tightened around my wrist. It's calling again, she whispered. Not the Emperor. Not the presence. The warp itself. A storm gathered beyond the veil, dark, luminous, hungry. Bolts of psychic lightning writhed along the edges of the cracks, silent and cold. The horizon blurred as winds tore across the plains, dragging dust into spiraling vortexes. Then we heard it. A low moan. Not human. Not machine. Not the echo of the presence. The world itself was straining. The overseer turned to us, her voice low and urgent. We need to get off the spire now. We moved as one, stumbling toward the hatch. But before we descended, I glanced back through the aperture. The world below seemed to hold its breath. The sky pulsed once in warning. The veil trembled. And I knew with sickening certainty, the next voice would not whisper. It would roar. And the Emperor, dreaming in agony upon the golden throne, would hear it. The descent through the spire felt far more perilous than the climb had ever been. The metal stairs shuddered beneath our boots, resonating with each distant tremor rolling through the air. The sound wasn't thunder, nor machinery, nor shifting stone. It was the muffled groan of reality itself, strained, stretched, pulled taut by forces we were never meant to feel. The walls vibrated with it. The railings hummed under our fingertips. Even the air tasted charged, metallic, as though a storm of pure warp lightning brewed just beyond the horizon. Lyra clung to my arm, each step careful but certain, as if her body knew the descending path even without sight. The overseer led the way, pushing the pace, while the technician followed close behind us, muttering calculations under his breath, numbers collapsing into fear. Halfway down the central staircase, another tremor shook the spire. Dust poured from above. I threw an arm around Lyra, steadying her as she gasped in sudden pain. "It's happening faster," she whispered, gripping my sleeve. "The presence, it's no longer waiting for alignment. It's forcing it." The overseer didn't slow. "Move. If the veil tears again while we're inside this tower, it'll collapse on top of us." Another shudder, sharper this time, rippled through the structure, like a giant hand dragging its nails across the spire's outer shell. A metallic shriek rang in the distance. One of the support beams above us snapped and fell, crashing into the steps barely a meter behind the technician. He stumbled forward with a cry. We sprinted the remaining length, bursting through the spire's lower hatch and into the open air just as the entire upper section groaned ominously. The sky above us pulsed with sickly gold light, the cracks in the veil brightening in uneven, trembling intervals. The light washed across the settlement like the glow from a broken sun. People staggered through the streets, some limp, some crawling, some clutching their ears as though trying to keep their minds from spilling out. Children sobbed into their parents' arms. Workers knelt in the dust, praying with hushed, frantic voices. Others simply stared upward, hypnotized by the burning fractures overhead. Then the wind died all at once. Every conversation, every sob, every prayer stopped. The world froze in collective dread. Lyra lifted her head. Her entire body went rigid. "It's here." The words barely escaped her lips before the sky convulsed. Light burst across the heavens, silent, cold, merciless. The cracks in the veil widened for a heartbeat, revealing slivers of something behind them. Not color, not darkness. Something like depth, a fathomless expanse pressing against the boundary of real space, with the weight of a submerged leviathan rising toward the surface. A pulse exploded outward. This one hit like a blow. A wave of psychic force slammed across the world, knocking us to our knees. My consciousness flickered, blackness edging into my vision. The overseer gritted her teeth, clutching the ground to keep herself from collapsing fully. Voices echoed through the pulse, not words, but overlapping tones, layered harmonics that skittered across the mind like claws dragging across frozen glass. The sound carved itself into the air, vibrating through skin and bone until everything inside me felt hollow and weightless. People screamed. Others went silent, their eyes rolling back. The technician curled into himself, shaking violently. "It's too strong. It's too strong, Emperor. It's tearing through." Another pulse struck, sharper, deeper. My skull felt split. I pressed my forehead to the ground, fighting the rising nausea. Overhead, the cracks in the veil glowed like molten metal. Lyra forced herself upright, her breaths ragged, eyes hidden behind the trembling bandages. "He hears it," she whispered through clenched teeth. "The Emperor hears it." "How do you know?" the overseer gasped. Lyra's body convulsed once, raw pain flashing through her voice. "Because his dreaming just changed." Another fissure of gold crawled across the sky, brightening the world in a haze of shimmering brilliance. The pulse hammered through the settlement again, shorter now, urgent. Not inquisitive, not curious, insistent, calling. The technician choked. If he responds. Lyra's voice cut through him, hoarse and shaking. "The Astronomican will flare." The overseer's eyes widened in horror. "And if it flares at full power?" The implications didn't need to be spoken. Every navigator in the Imperium, every psyker, every astropath, every ship in the warp, every thread binding humanity's survival, would burn with it. A final pulse rolled through us, deep enough to rattle the bones of the world. Then, all at once, silence, a stillness so profound it felt like the galaxy itself held its breath. Lyra whispered the only truth that fit the moment. "It's waiting for him to answer." The void above us shimmered, cracks glowing like open wounds across the sky. The warp storm beyond writhed. The presence lingered, silent, focused, breathless. And somewhere light years distant, upon the golden throne of Terra, a slumbering god shuddered in pain, in struggle, in half-remembered awakening. The veil trembled one last time. A question hanging between worlds. And the galaxy listened. The silence that followed felt unnatural. A void so complete it pressed against the lungs like the deep of a drowning sea. The world had been torn open by pulses of impossible resonance, shaken by forces that had no place in mortal reality. Yet now, everything stood unbearably still. No wind, no hum, no tremor. Even the dust hung motionless in the air, suspended as if time itself hesitated. The technician slowly lifted his head from the ground, his breath trembling. "It stopped," he whispered. "Why did it stop?" Lyra knelt in the dust, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the earth. Her bandaged eyes twitched beneath the cloth. She was listening, harder than before, listening to something just beyond the edge of existence. "It didn't stop," she murmured. "It's holding, waiting." The overseer pushed herself upright with visible effort. Her voice was low, ragged, but steady. "Waiting for what?" Lyra swallowed once, painfully. "For him." A cold shiver crawled down my spine, not because of the words themselves, but because of the certainty in her voice. The presence behind the veil, ancient, watching, patient, had pressed close enough to brush his dreaming, to tug at the flickering edges of the Astronomican, to call out across a gulf no human mind could fathom. And now it waited. The sky above the settlement remained fractured, a sheet of trembling radiance, thin as a veil of gold stretched to tearing. The cracks glowed faintly, but did not widen or fade. They pulsed slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Not like a heartbeat. Not like a machine. Something older. Something watching us as we watched it. The overseer stepped toward Lyra. "Can you feel him stirring?" Lyra's breath shuddered. "Not in the way you think. Not waking. Not rising. His mind is too far fractured for that. But his dreaming is shifting." She paused. "He is turning." The technician let out a hoarse, broken laugh. There was no humor in it. Only despair. Turning? Toward what? Toward that thing. Lyra didn't need to answer. We all felt the gravity of it. The presence behind the veil had called, and the Emperor had felt it. Perhaps not consciously, perhaps not with intent, but to something so vast, even the faintest flicker of his dreaming would echo like a star collapsing. Another tremor rolled through the sky. Not violent, not tearing, but soft, like the exhale of a giant settling its weight. The cracks dimmed slightly, then brightened again in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Lyra stiffened. "That's not the presence," she whispered. "That's him." The overseer's eyes widened. Then the horizon flared. A beam of faint, ghostly light, thin, wavering, almost invisible, rippled across the sky. Not from the veil, but from somewhere far beyond it. The air vibrated as the ghost light spread, touching the golden fractures, with a resonance that made every fiber of my being tighten with dread. The technician grabbed a railing. "What is that? What's happening?" Lyra rose slowly to her feet, unsteady but drawn upward by something none of us could see. "That," she whispered, "is the Astronomican shifting." The overseer froze. "Shifting? How?" Lyra lifted her trembling hands toward the sky, her voice breaking with awe and terror. "It is answering." A collective breath rippled through the settlement. Then, the veil brightened. The presence stirred. The golden cracks pulsed with renewed life. And the air split, not physically, not visibly, but perceptibly, as if every molecule of atmosphere trembled in anticipation of a voice about to break through the boundary of worlds. Lyra gasped. "He hears it." The overseer's voice pressed through clenched teeth. "Does he respond?" Lyra turned her head toward the trembling radiance overhead. Her voice was thin, barely more than a thread. "He tries." The cracks flared. A pulse of searing psychic light tore through the sky, short-lived but blinding. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as raw pressure flooded my skull. Distant screams rose from the settlement as others collapsed beneath the weight of the surge. And then, silence. The cracks dimmed. The sky steadied. The tremors stopped. Lyra swayed, collapsing to her knees. I caught her before she fell completely. Her breath came in soft, ragged gasps. "What happened?" I whispered. She shook her head weakly. "He reached. Just a fraction. A spark. but it was enough. Enough for what? The overseer demanded. Lyra lifted her face toward the now-still sky. To make the presence retreat. I froze. Retreat? Yes. Lyra's voice softened into something almost sorrowful. He did not wake. He did not rise. He did not speak. But the smallest shift of his dreaming was enough to force the presence back into the warp. The technician exhaled in disbelief. Then we're safe. Lyra's lips trembled. For now. The overseer knelt beside her. Will it return? Lyra answered with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen a truth too vast for language. Yes. Her fingers curled weakly in the dust. It will return. And next time, it will not seek to align with his dreaming. A long, quiet pause. It will seek him. The sky lay still once more, deceptively calm. The veil intact. The presence gone. The emperor silent upon his throne. But something had changed. Something irrevocable. Something the Imperium would not feel for weeks, months, maybe years. But we had felt it first. The galaxy, vast and ancient, held its breath, waiting, watching, listening, because somewhere deep in the warp, an ancient presence, the oldest forgotten shadow, had reached for the Emperor, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he had almost reached back.